Top 5 Creepypasta from November. 1. No limp.
I lived in a house with an extremely long, winding driveway. We grew up surrounded by the woods, and when it got late on summer evenings and the sun finally set after busy days of playing with my neighborhood friends, the darkness swallowed up our little plot of land, and it seemed like there was no end to that sea of trees around us, like it extended into ink in every direction. Naturally, I was terrified of those dark woods for reasons I couldn't explain. So as I got older, doing outdoor chores at night got harder and harder. Sometimes I'd have to take furniture off of the porch right before a big storm was approaching, or else it'd blow away. Sometimes I'd just have to take the trash to the curb. I ended up being assigned to that job, out of all of my 4 brothers. I don't know why my mom picked me, but I assume it was because I was always the most cautious one of the 5 Swanson kids. The first time I had to take the trash to the curb at night, I begged my dad to go with me out of fear. I kept doing it, so eventually we just got in the habit of doing it together. He didn't seem to mind too much anyway. That is, until the night it happened. The sunset was beautiful that night. The fireflies danced under swirls of purple and orange. We get pretty sunsets all the time around here, but something about this one was different. It was like Mother Earth was rewarding us for our hard work on that day. We had just finished demolishing an old shed that got crushed under an even older tree, uprooted by a summer storm. The clouds seemed to gather like witches around a fire in the heart of the forest, blocking out the gibbous moon that stared down at us like our mom did when we were in trouble. Thanks to the cloud coverage, it was so dark that we could barely see our feet in front of us as we were walking that familiar path down the barely paved drive. My dad cracked some kind of joke that I can't recall, and I chuckled to ease the tension. I had taken to walking as quickly as possible down that winding path when it was dark out. I'm sure the reason for that is obvious. My dad could just about keep up with me even when I was young and spry, and I wanted to spend as little time under that dark sky as possible. The trees on either side of the path loomed over us, but I could just barely make out the cloud-smeared stars past their jagged edges. I could hear my dad's footsteps behind me as I gripped the black trash bag closer, the plastic strip that made up the handle getting sweaty in my hand. I focused on that sound to calm myself as my nerves started acting up, anxiety nipping at my heels. Rhythmic were my dad's footsteps. He had a limp, had gotten his leg twisted up years back in a bad car crash, and it never quite healed right. The dull slap of his bad foot on the pavement steadied my thoughts. He was with me, and the world seemed safe. The woods even seemed almost warm. After what must have been at least a few minutes, I finally saw the end of the driveway. The stinky dumpster was a relief for once. It meant the trip was at least halfway over. I practically ran up to the dumpster, focusing on the rotten yellow of its lid rather than the thick woods ahead of us across the thin road that led to our house. I didn't want to look too deeply past that tree line. As I slammed the trash in, my dad passed me. I felt a cold chill pass down my spine when he stepped out onto the road, staring off into the woods or maybe the sky. I couldn't tell with his back facing me. My thoughts were hijacked by the sensation that my rear was no longer protected by my dad's mystical presence. I shot that thought down. He wouldn't be able to protect me anyway if there were really something wrong. Weird night tonight, huh, kiddo? My dad's rough voice came. I stifled an audible intake of air, not expecting him to say anything. He was a man of few words. I didn't know what he meant either, and I was already uneasy. Huh? Not really, I replied. It was just an average night, right? What was weird about it? I shut the lid to emphasize my point. I didn't want to seem rude, but I was done being here out so far away from the house, whose light was now a dim glimmer through the trees as the path back curved sharply in at least 2 spots. I turned away and took a step or two, ready to head back as quickly as possible. Are you afraid? I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart stopped too. Everything stood still for a second. I couldn't even begin to formulate a reply. My breath caught in my frozen lungs. That was not my dad's voice. It felt like an eternity before I was able to move even an inch, every fiber of my body wanting to flee. My only sanctuary was somehow wrong, and I didn't know why. I forced my feet to turn themselves around. Maybe my dad was just putting on a scary voice to prank me. He did that sometimes, knowing how cautious I was. Maybe he had gotten a frog in his throat. My mind clung to these fragile hopes as I looked back over my shoulder at him, hoping to gain some kind of information or at least find out if he was okay or not. My dad was standing in the middle of the road with his back facing me. "Dad? What's going on?" I asked in a tiny, frail tone. My voice cracked sharply, almost quivering in dread. He gave no response. Then, he slowly started turning around. Painfully slowly. With inhuman, almost robotic movements, one foot after the other, one arm swiveling to face me, as if it were detached from his torso. His legs swiveled next, each part turning one after the other. His torso followed, until finally his body fully faced me, except for his head. His head was still backward. And then, that started to turn too. I shrank backward in horror beyond my control. My brain lit up with fear chemicals, my nerves suddenly blazing with a primal fear response. Everything about this was wrong, and I had to get away, anywhere but here. I stood there, pissing my jorts in terror, for a good solid second further. He turned his head halfway before I bolted, and I'll regret that second before I started running for my whole life ahead of me, because I saw just a tiny bit of his face. Its face. It wasn't him, if you haven't gathered that already. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't him. My breath burned my lungs as I frantically scrambled back up the driveway, my vision going blurry. The clouds parted overhead, lighting my way back as my flip-flops slapped hard on the pavement. The gibbous moon trained its eyes on me from its seat in the ink-black sky, drinking in my fear. Behind me I heard something. Crunching, thumping, footsteps that didn't belong to my dad, plodding after me like a brown bear. Too heavy, too disordered. No limp either. I remember running further on that night than my body wanted to, my legs nearly buckling out from under me. Adrenaline took over as I followed the black serpent of the driveway. My thoughts were a blur, panic thrumming through my veins, every second half expecting to feel a cold, clammy hand finally gripping my shoulder. But the hand never stole my soul away from my flesh. I pounded up the stairs, threw open the front door, slammed it shut with all my strength, and locked it as quickly as my shaking, sweaty fingers would allow. With my back pressed against the wall, I slid down and wrapped my arms around my knees. My face burned from the tears, the warmth of home doing nothing to comfort me as I struggled to catch my breath, my feet aching. A few shuddering, painful gasps were all I could manage before another thought trapped me in frozen, stiff silence. What if the lock wasn't enough? What if it got in anyway? My eyes flicked up to the window in the door. I was terrified I'd catch another glimpse of that ghastly pale thing that might have once been my dad's familiar face. But seeing the emptiness of the night sky was somehow worse. I took another breath as I got to my feet, gripping the door handle as if, in the event of the lock failing, my own grip strength would keep the thing out. Looking back on it, that's absolutely fucking laughable. But at the time I was acting on pure instinct, which might explain why I stupidly peered out through the glass, scanning for any signs of life. I strained my eyes, trying in vain to see anything past the tree line. Even with the clouds parted, the woods held onto their secrets with a tight grip. After a minute or two, finally something changed. The dim light couldn't hide the trees shaking, the leaves parting, and something... Rah! I leapt out of my goddamn skin. An outstretched fist connected with something meaty. My dumbass brother, Eric, materialized out of thin air, the door behind him ever so slightly ajar. Ow! What the fuck, dickhead? He complained, rubbing his cheek. I cussed him out, my panic and rage overflowing, my head shaking from how hard I was spitting insults at him. After several minutes of back and forth arguing, I finally calmed down enough to explain the situation to him. I'm sure it made absolutely no sense whatsoever. When I finished, he just gave me a weird look, like I had grown a horn on my forehead. "Dude, are you okay? Have you been taking your meds?" he asked quietly, shifting his position in discomfort. Something about his body language said, "Are you high?" This only pissed me off further. "You either need to believe me or get the fuck out of here right now," I shouted, enraged. "Make yourself useful and go tell Mom to call the damn cops. There's something out there, something bad." He stepped back at my yelling but didn't go anywhere. He rubbed his shoulder, looking aside. Okay, I believe you. Jesus, calm down." We both fell quiet, looking at each other for a minute. Then I focused my eyes out the window again. Nothing. Empty front porch, empty yard, empty driveway. The faceless woods still met my gaze. "It's just, your story doesn't really make a lot of sense. Dad's been out on a fishing trip for a few days now. Did Mom not tell you?"
2. Kyle loves to laugh in the woods.
He sat behind the long, heavy table, his small body almost swallowed by its size. His eyes were glassy, stained with tears that had fallen on his freckled face. I walked over and sat down, gazing at the dark-haired boy as his mother, with similar hair and features, held his small hand. "Derek, can you tell me the last time you saw your friend Jimmy?" I inquired softly. "I saw him at the edge of the woods," Derek stuttered, his hands clenching his mother's tightly. "He was looking in there and said he heard something." "Did you see anyone, like anybody strange?" He shook his head. "I didn't see anyone, officer." "What about before that?" I asked, my mind flashing through a slideshow of little Jimmy's body, found in a shallow creek bed, the side of his head stained with a mixture of dried mud and blood. Each image paused in my mind before the next one appeared. "No, I didn't see anything," Derek said softly. His mom looked at me with concern. No parent wants to see their child questioned, no matter how gently, by a detective in a police station. "I promise, it won't be much longer," I said, trying to reassure her worried expression. I paused, carefully choosing my next question so as not to overwhelm the 10-year-old boy. "Did Derek say anything before he went into the woods?" "He said he heard a boy laughing in the woods." Derek sobbed, more tears welling up in his eyes. I handed him a tissue and he wiped away the tears from his soft cheek. "He said it sounded like the boy was having lots of fun, and we tried to tell him not to go in there because we needed to go home." "Did he say he saw the boy?" "No one ever sees it when Kyle laughs in the woods," Derek squeaked, his eyes wide with fear. "No one ever can ever see Kyle until it's too late." "All right, Derek, go home. Just know that we're on the case and we'll find out who hurt your friend," I replied, standing up and looking over at his mother, whom Derek was now gripping tightly. "Danny Patterson has put that scary story in his head," the mother seethed. "He came up to us at the grocery store and kept saying how Kyle loves to laugh in the woods." "Danny Patterson, you say?" I inquired, my curiosity piqued. "Yeah, he's your friend. Tell him to leave us alone, Jake," she said. "Me and Danny Patterson haven't really been close since junior high," I remarked, slightly annoyed. Even to this day, in this small town, and as a police officer, I was still associated with Danny Patterson, a drunkard who I only ever interacted with in the drunk tank or on the street. But I'll talk to him. "They should really just put a fence up around that creek," Sam said dismissively. If I hadn't been in the car and listening over the speakers, I would have shot him an annoyed look. "It's a steep fall and all the rocks below it make it even more hazardous." "I'm just as aware of that as you are, Sam," I huffed, passing the small gas station where we used to get soda and candy bars when we were wandering the small town looking for adventures. "This is the third time in 10 years a body has been found in that creek." "Yeah, because kids fall in it, and the town should do something about it." The kid said that his friend heard a boy laughing in the woods before he disappeared. "Oh God, not the Kyle loves to laugh in the woods bullshit again," Sam grumbled as I continued to drive past Dirkler Road's Church of Christ. "They've been saying that since we were kids." "It started when we were kids, Sam." "Yeah, it did, but that doesn't mean we have to obsess about a town's legend," Sam retorted. Do you think some ghost kid bashed another kid's head in? Of course not. I want to know if someone else did. Or if he fell into the creek bed like the others. As I was formulating a way to convey my annoyance, I saw something small with dark hair running across the road. My car was about to collide with it. I could see a boyish smile on the figure's face. "Shit!" I yelled, stomping on the brakes. The screech of rubber and pavement echoed through the car as I turned the wheel right. My car slid onto the shoulder and into the grass. "Jake, are you there?" Sam shouted as my heart raced. I quickly put the car in park and looked around, but there was no sign of the little boy. "Jake, do I need to call the police?" "I am the police, Sam." "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I am. I almost hit a kid." "Where are you at?" "I'm at the park close to the Dirkler Road Church." "Wait, you're going to the crime scene?" "I am," I replied, as I saw the ghosts of my childhood past. The sway of swings in the fall wind, the crack of branches scraping against each other in the canopy of the woods, and the sight of playground equipment. The once red slide was almost white from being sun-bleached over the last 20 years. The monkey bars were rickety and dangerous. Hardly anyone ever came to this playground. "I'll call you back. I'm going to check on the kid." "All right, call me back when you wrap up." "Sure," I said, hanging up the phone and opening the car door. The wind roared briefly as I looked around trying to find the kid, but there was no sign of him. I began walking towards the playground where I could see the tree line that led to the woods where Jimmy had gone before disappearing and later being found dead in the creek bed. "Hey, anyone out there?" I yelled out. "I just want to make sure you are okay." I heard the snap of a few sticks as if someone was running through the woods. I picked up the pace, awaiting a reply, but none came. When I said, "I'm with the police," the sound of small footsteps running continued from the woods. I stopped at the edge of the woods. More ghosts of the past came to mind, another slideshow playing in my head. Sam, Danny, and I running around these woods, on a sugar high from candy bars and soda. "Kid, I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to make sure you're all right," I said, taking a deep breath before stepping into the woods. Another footstep crunched through the leaves, coming from what sounded like the left. I turned to see what looked like small fingers curled around a tree, as if someone was hiding. "Come on out now," I shouted, walking towards the tree. I slowed down as I observed the fingers. They were discolored, almost a rotten green, and looked far too wrinkled to belong to a child. "Hey, I need you to come out from there," I said, feeling uneasy. I unclipped my holster and placed my hand on my gun, but something stopped me. The sound of laughter, like a child trying to imitate a demonic cackle, filled the air. "Come out now!" I shouted. My command was greeted by more chortling and giggling. "Just because you're a kid doesn't mean I can't detain you, you know," I insisted, standing about 10 feet away from the tree. The fingers curled further, almost as if trying to dig into the trunk. The sound of heavier footsteps rustling through the leaves came from behind me. I pulled out my gun, gripping it tightly with both hands, and whipped around. A haggard man with a beer belly protruding from his deep red flannel shirt, his jeans stained with dirt and dead leaves. His dark beard and hair showed signs of aging, streaked with gray, and his heavy-lidded eyes met mine with surprise. "Jake, what are you doing here?" "No, the question is, what are you doing here, Danny?" I huffed angrily. "You know a crime happened here, right?" "Yeah, I know that. I'm here to get answers." "And how the hell are you going to do that?" I asked, turning toward the tree. The fingers were gone, replaced only by silence. No more laughter. "I'm handling the case." "Just because you're a cop now doesn't make you superior or a better person," Danny mocked as I walked to the tree and peered behind it. Nothing remained, not even an imprint in the soil or the dead leaves on the ground. "No, but it makes me wonder what you're doing here." "I told you what I'm doing here." "Walking around the park after harassing a little boy who just lost his friend." "I didn't harass anyone, Jake," Danny grumbled as he approached, and I holstered my gun. "He knows what happened to him." "And what is that, Danny?" "You know Kyle loves to laugh in the woods." "I'm done here," I snapped, scanning the ground for footprints. Danny shuffled quickly behind me. You know someone could think you're the suspect walking around here. Are you going to arrest me, Jake? For interfering in a police investigation? Come on, you and I both know that it's very real, Danny insisted, trying to keep up the pace. You can pretend all you want, but you know, I know, and Sam, wherever he is, knows. No, only you think an angry boy ghost is killing kids, I shouted, turning to face Danny. His breath and clothing reeked of cheap whiskey and cigarettes. Sam thinks it's ridiculous too. Then why are you here? Because I want to know what happened to that poor fucking boy. The sound of laughter echoed through the woods as I paused, trying to pinpoint its source. I looked at Danny, who seemed frozen, his eyes wide and his mouth agape. You can't tell me you aren't hearing it, Danny prodded. Yeah, I saw a kid run across the street as I was driving here. It was him, Jake. No, it was some kid with black hair. He was very real. The laughter grew louder as I glanced past Danny's shoulder to see a small figure standing about 15 feet behind him. I pointed at Danny, urging him to turn around. The small boy had discolored skin, a sickly green like his fingers, and a strangely shaped head as if part of it had caved in. Jake, it's him, you can't deny what you're seeing. Stay right there, kid, I ordered, placing my hand on my gun. Danny quickly ducked behind me as the two of us stared at the ghoulish boy. He bared a rotten-toothed grin and began to laugh uncontrollably. Stop laughing. He continued to laugh, mocking us, the sound echoing through the woods almost painfully loud. As I moved closer, Danny grabbed my arm trying to stop me, but the creature kept laughing, giggling and chuckling demonically. Jake, you remember when we visited here when we were kids, right? Shut the fuck up, Danny. You remember the game we used to play? Danny persisted, gripping my arm to lower my gun. Me, you and Sam, we played it about 5 times. Danny, let go of me, I snarled, breaking free from his grasp. The boy cackled once more before turning and walking away. No, stop right there. He continued walking deeper into the woods. Frustrated, I shoved Danny away, watching him tumble to the ground. You remember the last time we played the game? It was my turn, Jake. As I turned, the boy had vanished completely. I'm going after him. You can sit here and relive our childhood if you want, I replied coldly, as Danny stood up and brushed himself off. We aren't talking about that stupid game. We ventured deeper into the woods in silence. I searched for any clue, any sign of where he'd gone. We never got a bunch of new kids in our school. Danny finally broke the quiet. Not a lot of people want to move to a small town, I guess, I replied, trying to maintain a normal conversation, as if I hadn't just seen a grotesque child. There's a reason you're here, Jake. Yeah, because I'm a goddamn detective. No, it's something more, Danny replied, as I heard the sound of water in the distance. We were nearing the creek bed where Jimmy's body had been found. You do remember the game, I know you do. I don't want to talk about this, Danny. The sound of rushing water grew louder. Then, that chilling laughter echoed through the woods. It was my turn that day, remember? I swear to fucking God. The game we used to play with the new kids, Danny continued. We would come here and tell them a spooky story that we made up. We reached the edge of the creek bed, and as I peered down, I saw the boy staring up at the two of us. What do you want me to say, Danny? I asked, locking eyes with the ghoulish boy. I don't think there's anything you can say to make it better, but just admit what happened that day, Danny replied, also staring at him from the creek bed. One of us would disappear into the woods and laugh like crazy to freak the new kid out. Yeah, I said dully. But I never suspected one of them would run into the woods to try to find what was making the laughter. But he did, Danny said. So I remember I went behind him and laughed the most evil laugh that an 11-year-old could do and grabbed him. I remember. He got so scared he just booked it through the woods, but he didn't know them like we did, Danny stated, looking at me with a grin and nod before starting to climb down the creek bed. What are you doing? I remember hearing him scream, and then it got quiet. Danny murmured as I heard his feet splash into the creek bed. Sam chickened out and ran home, but not you. The boy who loved to laugh in the woods, I replied as I watched Danny get closer to the boy, who knelt down and picked up a rock in his hand. That's what we called the game. Yeah, it was my turn that day to be the boy who loved to laugh in the woods, Danny said as he kneeled in front of the boy, who held the rock high in the air. Do you remember what happened after? He ran and fell in the creek bed. What did we do, Jake? We saw him knocked out and ran away, I answered. We thought we would get in trouble, so we left him here. But he didn't wake up. He died, and when they found him, they thought it was an accident. No one dared to bother to ask us if we were with him that day. Yay. Not even his parents knew he was hanging out with us that day after school, Danny continued. They thought he just wandered away and fell. Danny, get out of there. I don't know if this will make a difference, but maybe it will end it. Stop it, Danny. Jake, one more thing. What? What was his name? Danny asked as the boy hit him with the rock. As I watched the blood begin to ooze from his skull, the boy continued to beat Danny violently with the rock. I stood frozen before muttering the name. Kyle.
3. I went cave exploring with some friends. I'm the only one that survived.
I used to think Mammoth Cave was just another adventure, a tick off our list. It was supposed to be fun, a weekend to explore the shadows with my best friends, to test our nerves in the endless dark. But somewhere down there, under miles of stone, something went wrong. Now, one of us is missing, and I swear, I can still hear him calling. We'd been going for hours, our voices echoing through the tunnels, each one mocking the confidence we had when we started. There was me, Sam, and my friends Luke, Jared, and Ben. Ben was always the daring one, the first to wander ahead, the one who'd get us into trouble just to laugh it off. But when he didn't come back, no one was laughing. It's strange. We retraced our steps, searched every crevice, calling his name until our voices scraped raw. Nothing. Just an endless silence, heavy and swallowing. And then, the faintest echo, like Ben's voice, drifting from somewhere deep in the shadows. Luke was the first to hear him calling. He stopped dead, his hand shooting up as we walked, telling us to listen. We froze, straining against the thick silence. Did you hear that? He whispered, his voice barely louder than a breath. None of us had, but as we stood there letting the silence settle around us, we heard it. A faint, distant call, almost swallowed by the stone around us. It was Ben's voice, unmistakably. He was calling out, the sound barely reaching us but bouncing off the cave walls in strange, warped echoes. The direction was wrong, though. The call wasn't coming from where we'd last seen him. It was coming from one of the tunnels we hadn't even traveled down. But maybe somehow the paths were connected. It wasn't impossible for cave tunnels to intersect. We were probably about 2 miles down at this point, so deep that the silence felt alive, closing in around us. The chill in the air seeped into our bones, and every breath echoed back like a reminder of how far we'd come. The walls felt tighter here, the space around us shrinking with each step. Our lights cast shaky beams on the rough stone, cutting through just enough darkness to keep us moving. We'd packed extra batteries, sure, but even with the supplies, an uneasy feeling twisted in my gut. Still, leaving wasn't an option. Ben was down there somewhere, and we couldn't just abandon him in the dark. We walked down a few hundred feet, calling out Ben's name into the dark, then waiting in silence, hoping for any kind of response. The cave swallowed our voices, leaving only the faint drip of water somewhere far off. Then, after what felt like ages, we heard him. It came from behind us. "What the fuck?" Luke whispered, his voice tight and shaky, eyes darting back toward the path we'd just covered. Jared, louder than any of us, shouted back, "All right, Ben, you can stop messing with us now, man. This isn't funny, bro." I wanted to believe it, that Ben was just messing with us, hiding in some shadowed nook and waiting to jump out. But as I stared into the empty tunnel behind us, a chill crept over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow it wasn't really Ben. We backtracked, our lights slicing through the shadows as we searched every inch of the area. We moved slowly, scouring every nook, every crack in the walls, but there wasn't a single trace of Ben. Not a footprint, not even a scuff mark. He was just gone. Eventually, we returned to the central cavern, slumping down on the cold stone to catch our breath and regroup. I told the others what had been gnawing at me, the dread curling around my thoughts. But Luke was quick to brush it off. "Oh, come on, man, you know Ben is just fucking with us," he said, his tone forced like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Well, how did he end up back here then, when he was down there before?" I shot back. "I'm telling you guys, something isn't right." Before anyone could answer, Ben's voice echoed again, faint but unmistakable. This time it came from the tunnel we'd seen him go down first. "Come on, guys, this way." His voice drifted down the rocky corridors, a lazy drawl that somehow felt wrong. Jared sprang to his feet, shouting down the tunnel, "Screw you, Ben. When I see you, I'm gonna beat the shit out of you." Then we heard it, a low, chuckling laugh, the sound echoing, but from a completely different tunnel. Luke and Jared exchanged glances, the bravado draining from their faces. It was like the air had thickened, and now they felt it too. Something was off. A chill crept over all of us, settling in our bones as Ben's laughter faded into the shadows. We huddled together, whispering hurriedly about what to do. The idea of leaving came up quick, but Luke shut it down fast. "We can't just leave Ben down here, guys," he insisted, voice firm but edged with unease. Jared shook his head, glancing toward the distant exit. "I'm going. I'll call the cops and tell them our friend's missing. I'll come back with a search party." It wasn't a bad idea, honestly. Part of me felt relief at the thought of professionals with equipment and experience. But Luke wouldn't budge, his jaw set, determination in his eyes. He wanted to keep looking, convinced that Ben was close, just around the next corner. Jared didn't wait for more argument. With a last look back, he took off down the path toward the exit, his flashlight bouncing along the walls until he was out of sight. Luke and I stood there in silence, the weight of the decision hanging heavy between us. Eventually, we decided to search a little longer. Just a little longer, we told ourselves. After Jared disappeared from sight, Luke and I ventured down the same tunnel Ben had vanished into. We called out, voices barely steady, and after a moment, Ben's voice drifted back, faint and distorted, like it was caught in a slow echo. The sound seeped out of a dark, narrow crevice ahead, just wide enough for us to squeeze through. We moved cautiously, each step slower than the last, feeling a prickling sensation on our necks, like unseen eyes were watching us from the shadows. The path bent sharply to the right, creating the illusion that it might loop back toward one of the other tunnels. Luke forced a chuckle. "See? He's just messing with us." But as we rounded the corner, our lights caught something that made us stop dead. A jagged hole yawned open in the middle of the path, wide and deep, cutting off the tunnel. The space was too narrow to walk side by side, so I trailed behind Luke as he edged forward and aimed his flashlight down into the darkness below. Luke went silent, his light fixed on something I couldn't see. I waited, the quiet pressing in, until the tension grew unbearable. "What is it?" I whispered, trying to peer around him. When he turned to me, his face was drained of color, eyes wide, lips parted like he couldn't quite find the words. He swallowed, barely managing to get it out. "He's down there," Luke said, his voice trembling. My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" I stammered, heart pounding against my ribs. "He's down there, Sam," Luke whispered, voice cracking. "Dead." The words hit me like a punch. I stood there, numb with disbelief, until Luke grabbed my arm, his grip almost painful. "We have to get out of here," he said, voice tight with terror. Without another word, we turned and started back, moving fast but steady, our lights casting frantic beams along the rough stone walls. As we reached the tunnel that led back to the central cavern, another voice echoed through the darkness. "Guys, Neither of us paused. We broke into a sprint, feet pounding against the ground, breaths ragged with panic. We didn't care where it was coming from. We just wanted out. In his haste, Luke stumbled over a jagged rock and fell hard, his flashlight skidding across the ground before shattering into pieces. I stopped, reaching down to pull him up, my light sweeping the walls as I moved. And that's when I saw it. A figure, pale and naked, crouched at the far end of the tunnel, watching us with hollow, empty eyes. It looked almost human, but something was horribly, horribly wrong. "Oh my God," I muttered, my voice barely a whisper, trembling as I stared at the figure. Luke turned, catching sight of it, his face twisting in terror. He grabbed my arm, jolting me out of my daze. "Come on, Sam," he urged, pulling me forward. We didn't look back, rushing through the darkness, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever that thing was. Every shadow felt like it was closing in on us, every echo stretching our nerves tighter. As we reached the main tunnel that led out of the cave, we saw a figure lying on the ground ahead. Jared. He was sprawled face down, motionless, his flashlight lying a few feet away, casting an eerie glow on the stone. "Oh God," I breathed, heart racing as we knelt beside him. He must have tripped, maybe knocked himself out in his rush to get out. But when we turned him over, the breath left my lungs. His face was unrecognizable, crushed and bloody, as if something had beaten him down over and over. The horror of it froze us in place, and I could barely think, only feel the cold grip of fear sinking deeper into my bones. That's when we heard it. A voice drifting from the shadows, but this time it wasn't Ben's. It was Jared's. "Come on, guys, this way," the voice called, soft and taunting. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, heart hammering, and there it was, standing just beyond the light's reach. Pale, humanoid, but wrong in every way. Its skin was chalky, almost luminescent under the beam, and its eyes, solid, black, empty, and endless. The thing stared at us for a moment, then turned, its movements jerky and unnatural, and ran down the tunnel, laughing in Jared's voice, a sick, twisted echo of the friend we'd known. "What the hell?" Luke whispered, voice barely audible over my own pounding heart. He grabbed my arm, his grip trembling. "We have to get out of here, man." I didn't need any convincing. We bolted, feet slamming against the stone, the darkness stretching ahead of us like a maw, ready to swallow us whole. As we ran, the creature's footsteps echoed close behind, its pace relentless. My heart pounded, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as we pushed forward. Suddenly, Luke stumbled and fell, hitting the ground hard. I skidded to a stop, spinning around, and that's when I saw it. The creature had caught up to him, gripping his leg and starting to drag him back into the shadows. Luke clawed at the ground, his face contorted in terror. Without thinking, I shone my flashlight directly on it, and as the beam hit, the creature shrank back, raising its long, bony arms to shield its huge black eyes. It couldn't stand the light. That much was clear. I stepped toward Luke, light fixed on the creature as it hissed and retreated, slipping back into the pitch-black depths of the cave. We backed away slowly, both of us trembling, the silence around us settling like a heavy weight. We kept moving, trying to keep our steps steady, though every nerve in our bodies screamed to run. Luke fumbled in his bag, pulling out his spare flashlight, and now, with both beams cutting through the shadows, we scanned every crevice, every dark corner around us. The creature was silent now, but its presence clung to us, a feeling so thick it was hard to breathe. We both knew it was still near, lurking just out of sight, watching and waiting. Minutes stretched on, each one more suffocating than the last. But then, just as panic threatened to take over, we saw it. The cave entrance, a sliver of remaining daylight spilling in, piercing through the darkness like a lifeline. It was so close, a beacon of hope after the nightmare that had nearly swallowed us whole. We made it, or at least, we thought we did. Step by step, We edged closer to the exit, the sunlight drawing us in, so close I could almost feel its warmth. But just as we reached the final stretch, the creature dropped down from above, a blur of pale skin and black eyes, crashing into Luke and sending him sprawling to the ground. I whipped around, frantically aiming my light, but it was too late. In an instant, the creature pinned him down, smashing his head against the stone with brutal force. Paralyzed for a split second, my mind screamed at me to act, to do something. But instinct took over. I turned and ran, abandoning Luke's final, muffled cries, leaving my friend behind. Tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision as I pushed myself forward, barely seeing the light ahead. When I finally burst out of the cave into the fading daylight, I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, chest heaving, and the weight of loss crashing over me. The tears came hard, unstoppable, as I lay there, shattered, knowing I was the only one who'd made it out. As I forced myself to stand, steadying my breath, I heard it, Luke's voice, faint and choked with fear, calling out from the depths of the cave. "Sam, please, help me." I froze, every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, to remember what I'd seen, to remember that Luke was gone. But hearing his voice, broken and desperate, twisted my insides. The guilt clawed at me, sharper than any fear. I had left him. I had abandoned him. The pleading continued, soft but relentless, each word pulling at the frayed edges of my sanity. Some part of me wanted to turn back, to run into the dark, convinced he was waiting, that I could still save him. But another part, a colder, darker part, knew the truth. It wasn't Luke. It was the creature, mimicking his voice, sinking its claws into the last threads of hope I had left. And yet, what if, somehow, it really was him? The thought tore at me, leaving me stranded there, helpless and shattered, unable to move forward or look back. Finally, I forced myself to turn away from the cave, each step heavier than the last. I had to leave. I had to get out and tell someone what had happened, no matter how impossible it all seemed. But as I reached the edge of the forest, the realization settled in. I couldn't tell them the truth. They'd never believe me. No one would. I could already picture the looks of doubt, the whispers, the judgment. So I rehearsed the lie as I stumbled into town, every word twisting in my throat. I told them we were stalked by someone in the cave, that he'd ambushed us, attacked Jared and Luke. I described a faceless killer lurking in the dark, hunting us down one by one. It was easier that way, easier than trying to explain the unexplainable. The cops didn't let it go. They pressed me for hours, asking the same questions over and over, watching my every reaction. Soon enough, they began talking to my friends and family, probing into my relationship with the group. I could see it in their eyes. They suspected me. I was the last one out, the only one who'd made it back, and my story didn't add up. They searched the cave for days, combing through every passage, every cavern. Eventually, they found Ben's body, crumpled at the bottom of that pit, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. But Luke and Jared, they were gone. Their remains were never recovered. The only thing I know for certain is that I'll never step foot in another cave for as long as I live. The thought alone makes my skin crawl, my heart race. The darkness isn't just unsettling to me now. It's a living, breathing terror, wrapping itself around every corner, every shadow. I'm afraid of the dark in ways I never imagined, paranoia gnawing at me every time I turn off a light. Even here, in my own home, I can feel it, the creature's gaze, lurking just beyond the glow of my lamp, hidden in the pockets of darkness, patient and unyielding. It's waiting for me. I can feel it, lurking, watching, waiting for that one moment when I'm left alone in the dark. And I know, deep down, that it won't stop until it pulls me back into the shadows, just like it did with them.
4. I heard my name in the woods.
Yeah, that's right. I heard my name in the woods. If you're Appalachian, you shuddered at the title of this alone. If you're not, I'll explain. My grandfather went to be with the Lord a few years ago now. He grew up in a small wooden shack a mile off the road. There's a small Hellfire Brimstone Pentecostal church off the main road. We attended there a few times with him for revivals, but oftentimes we would park there and walk to his small house. Along the road, he would tell us all kind of spooky stories, which I'll perhaps share one day. He also told us about all kinds of stories through his life, about his parents, and what it was like growing up in such harsh conditions. The conditions I'm talking about is probably what you expect to hear coming from poor Southerners in Appalachia. No power, cooking only over an open fire, etc. He also told us about how he would stuff hay through the cracks of the wood to try to provide some insulation against the harsh winters. The cabin wasn't much, probably 150-200 esque fort. There were 2 bedrooms, and by that I mean one very large room where the family would gather and the kids would sleep. The second room was where his parents slept. Along the creek bed near his house, there was a fresh spring you could get water, and there was a house attached to a school bus where his uncle lived. It's been years since I had visited the house. Occasionally, we would have family meals out there for a picnic, bringing friends to come see the place. Some land disputes got in the way as the land had been split and divided, and drug addict and drug addicts had got in the mix. Grandpa went up there often during the last few years of his life to tear down fences people put up trying to keep us out. During those walks, my brother and I used to take with Grandpa. He told us all kinds of superstitions, many of which I hold today. Examples would be to not show my teeth to a writing spider or to close an open pocket knife. He also would tell me about things like hearing your name in the woods. In the words of Grandma, there are haints and boogers in the woods. I was visiting Grandma lately and we were talking about Grandpa and the old cabin, and I got the itch to just go sit there for a bit and think. See, Grandpa really was the greatest man I knew. I figure maybe if I could go sit on the steps to the old cabin, I could have some form of communion with him. Now, I didn't make it clear at the beginning of this post. The road into the cabin was somewhat accessible in a vehicle, provided you have a 4-wheel, which I did. But it make more sense to me now why we always walked it. Grandpa wanted us to have that quality time. So when I got off the main road, I parked my SUV at the church, thinking back on the times I'd see Grandpa lifting his arms and praising Jesus, about how the first girl I had ever loved used to go there, and how the preacher man would be running around the congregation feeling that Pentecostal fire. Getting out the car, I took a slow walk to the cabin. I enjoyed hearing the acorns under my boots pop, and the leaves crunching, a few birds tweeting their familiar songs, and the water from the creek a short ways yonder. When I made it to the cabin, I had a bag of mixed emotions, I suppose. I missed Grandpa a whole lot. I was angry that the meth heads who lived nearby had littered the cabin with drink bottles, and I was bothered by the men who thought they should restore the property when all they did was take away the character of the place my grandpa loved. I went by the creek, and there it was familiar. The school bus was still there. There was a bicycle wheel stuck in the ground that Grandpa would put a stick in when he was a young boy and roll around the property, and I filled my water bottle with some of that spring water. As far as I was concerned, that was holy water. After kneeling down for a quick prayer and let a small cry out, I decided it was time to make it back to my car. That's when I heard it. It was almost a whisper. Surely, I hearing things. Nightfall wasn't too far away, and I brushed it off as a small fear. But then again, man's voice, Philip. I now noticed I couldn't hear squirrels rustling in the leaf piles, or the birds chirping. I tried to think. That wasn't any of my family's voices. Grandma was the only one who knew I came here. And she isn't the kind of woman to use a phone to tell family I came by the old house. It couldn't have been any of the tweakers that lived on the edge of the property. None of them would know my name. Philip came a tone that was giggling and somewhat sinister. This was it. This is what my grandparents had told me about. These were haints and boogers trying to get me. I never knew what they meant by get me, but I sure didn't want to find out. I paced quickly towards the car, Mind you, it's only about a 15-minute walk. 10 if I jog. Philip, 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 the haint screamed. Philip, 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 the haint screamed. By now, I started jogging. This would save some time, and the sun was setting. I leap, came up the noise, like how a man will jokingly make the vibrato that a female opera singer has. Lord only knows why I turned. I broke the rule and acknowledged it. Who is there? I asked. Philip, 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 Philip. I closed my eyes and slapped myself a couple times. I was going crazy. None of this could be real. Then I saw something standing about 50 yards from me. It was the size of a short man, and he had on a devil mask and cape. Very cartoonish, like something someone would buy for Halloween, holding one of those plastic red pitchforks. A distorted, mangled voice came from it, howling and laughing. Ho, 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 Philip! I know what you're thinking. Run. And that's what I did. I ran. I only had maybe a quarter mile left to the car. I ran like never before, and his thing was hot on my trail. Philip. It sang out. Philip. 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 It cheered as it tackled me from behind. It quickly flipped me on my back and started digging into me. They were not hands. Skinnier than a nun's finger and sharper than nail. It drove both into my chest, scratching me all up and down and singing my name continuously. The primal noises that came from it and gleeful cheers, mixed with the fast breathing of my name, had to have echoed the woods. It eventually wrapped the claws around my throat. Shh. Philip Hugh. I could see the strain in its eyes and the pure hate this booger had. I chokingly reached for anything I could get, and I managed to get a rock. With any strength I had in me, I swung the rock into its head. Plastic didn't crumple from a Halloween mask, though. The rock caused bludgeon dent, like when you know you hear bone get hit through paper skin. As it rolled off me to howl, I managed to catch my breath and get up. There, I ran as hard as I could. There wasn't much. I could see the car and the church. It took one last tackle at me and scraped my ankle on its way down. But I did it. I made it to the church parking lot. The creature stopped where it was and wouldn't enter the lot. It just kept stomping and saying, "Come back, Philip, come back. Come back, Philip, come back. We need you, Philip." I climbed in my car and took off down the road, watching it dance by the moonlight, in a circle with 3 others just like it.
5. My wife has started to pray in her sleep.
The first time it happened, I almost dismissed it as a dream. It was the middle of the night, and I opened my eyes to a dark bedroom. The house was cool, pleasantly so, and the comfort of the blankets around me almost lulled me right back to sleep. Before I slipped into unconsciousness, I became aware of a faint whisper. Turning onto my side, I was surprised to see my wife sitting up in bed. Her body was turned away from me, angled towards the far corner of our room. I assumed at first that she was speaking to me, but her words came out in a constant, almost desperate stream. Once I became cognizant enough to decipher her hushed speech, I recognized it as a prayer. Gemma, though what I'd call a casually practicing Catholic, had never prayed in her sleep before. In fact, in the decade we'd been together, I hadn't known her to talk in her sleep at all. I found myself unsettled by the intensity of her words. Sitting up, I placed a hand on her back, and the touch seemed to startle her awake. She jerked forwards and opened her eyes, looking at me in confusion. "Hello?" she said, and something about the indignant way she said it dispelled the tension in the room. "Sorry to wake you, but you were talking in your sleep. Reciting the Our Father, actually." She found this amusing and was asleep again in no time. I, however, had a much more difficult time falling back asleep after that. Something told me to stay vigilant, though I couldn't for the life of me figure out why. Even as Gemma slept peacefully beside me, I kept finding myself sitting up to survey the dark corner she'd been angled towards while praying. A full week passed before it happened again. This time, when I awoke in the middle of the night, I could tell immediately that Gemma wasn't in bed next to me. I got up and walked into the hall, checking the upstairs rooms to no avail. When I went downstairs, I heard Gemma before I saw her. I followed the sound of frantic whispering into the living room, where she stood in front of the fireplace mantel, praying before a silver urn. As I drew nearer, I saw that Gemma's eyes were still closed. When I called out to her and didn't receive a response, I realized that she was still asleep somehow. I was thankful she hadn't fallen down the stairs, but I was also concerned with the sudden escalation of her parasomnia. The one thing I knew about sleepwalking was that you weren't supposed to wake the person up, so I gently put my hands on Gemma's shoulders and started to walk her back towards our bedroom. She didn't stop whispering as we walked, and, even stranger, I realized after a while that she wasn't speaking English. I thought it sounded like Latin, which wouldn't be too weird, right? Lots of Catholic prayers were originally written in Latin after all. That explanation was enough to reassure me as I walked through the dark house beside my sleeping wife. Or at least, it was enough until we reached the bottom of the stairwell, at which point Gemma opened her eyes, looked at me, and said, "You're both going to die in this house, Marco." For a moment, I was frozen in place, surprised by both her words and the absolute certainty behind them. It was only after her macabre statement that Gemma seemed to fully awaken. She blinked slowly, looking blearily at our surroundings. "Mark? What's going on? You were sleepwalking." "What? I've never sleepwalked in all my life." "Yeah. And you said something a little creepy at the end there. Do you remember anything? Maybe a dream that might have spilled out into real life?" As it turned out, Gemma had been dreaming, though not about me or the house. In her dream, she'd been laying immobile inside of a glass casket. She described two humanoid silhouettes on either side of her, one made of shadow and the other of pure light. The former poured water into the casket while the latter tried to scoop it out. She was unable to move as the water level crept higher and higher, threatening to cover her nose and mouth as the bright figure tried its best to slow the flood. Gemma and I, both fully alert at that point, went to the kitchen to drink some tea and wait for our nerves to settle. As the tea steeped, I found myself thinking of my mother-in-law, Therese, and not only because our cups had once belonged to her. Gemma's mother had lived with us for the last year of her life, and had passed away only a month prior to Gemma's first sleep-talking incident. As a result, there were reminders of her all over the house, her tea set in the kitchen, her mirror in the corner of our bedroom, her portrait hanging in the hall. But it was Gemma's words, not her mother's things, that made me think of Therese. "You see, my name is Mark, and everyone in my life refers to me as such, with the exception of my mother-in-law, who used to call me Marco." How strange it was that Gemma had called me that in her sleep. 2 weeks passed, and while I sometimes awoke to Gemma murmuring quiet prayers in her sleep, her sleepwalking seemed like a one-time incident. While Gemma continued to have nightmares, and while I continued to be somewhat creeped out by the sleep-talking, it wasn't a major impediment to our lives, and thus we both did our best to ignore it. That is, until this morning. It was just after 1 when I awoke. I'd grown accustomed to having my sleep interrupted by Gemma's prayers, but this time, I opened my eyes to find my wife's side of the bed empty. I rolled onto my back and was startled to see Gemma standing at the foot of our bed, facing towards the bedroom door. Her hands were clasped in front of her chest, her head bowed and her lips moving rapidly. Annoyed at having my rest disturbed yet again, I started to get out of bed when an odd sensation befell me. Before my foot touched the ground, I felt the overwhelming urge to stay put. For no reason that I could discern, I felt a compulsion to pull the covers over my head and hide like a child. "Gems?" I called out, and she raised an open palm towards me, signaling for me to stay put. "It's here," she said. I pushed down the urge and got out of bed, coming to a stop beside my wife. The air in the room was very, very cold. "Who?" I asked her, though I'm not sure why. I knew she was only sleep-talking, but she just sounded so damn certain. Gemma didn't answer. I looked towards the bedroom door and realized that at some point after I awoke, it had opened. My heartbeat quickened at the thought of an intruder in our house. Retrieving the baseball bat I kept under our bed, I began walking towards the door when Gemma suddenly moved, grabbing me by the wrist and pulling me backwards. "Don't move. Don't you move, Marco." That name again. "My love, what is going on with you? Why are you calling me that?" I gently pulled my free hand from her grip and put a palm on her cheek. When I touched her, I found that her skin was damp with tears. I felt a pang in my chest. Poor thing was probably having that same nightmare again. "Please wake up." For a moment, my wife was quiet. Her whispered prayers ceased and she stood there motionless as I willed her to awaken. Then, suddenly, she gasped, inhaling like someone who'd been holding their breath for a long time. Her eyes fluttered open, locking with mine. "Gemma?" I said, and then the house erupted with sound. The wall-mounted mirror came crashing to the ground, as did our framed family photo hanging near the door. Instinctively, I pulled Gemma close and wrapped my arms around her as the sound of shattering glass filled the room. A shard from the mirror had wedged itself into my calf and I cursed sharply. I waited for the tremors to subside, but after a minute, I realized that there were no tremors. It hadn't felt like an earthquake at all. Instead, it almost seemed like the mirror and photo had flung themselves off of the wall of their own volition. Gemma stirred in my arms and I let her go. She was fully awake by then, and so after telling her to be careful of the glass, I picked my way around the mess on the floor to check out the rest of the house. The scene was bizarre. Some objects had fallen and shattered in every room, but many of their neighboring items remained perfectly intact. The tea set in the kitchen, for example, had fallen from the shelf, but the row of glasses right next to it hadn't moved an inch. It looked like someone had walked through each room in the house and picked out a few specific objects to destroy. I found my wife in the living room, staring down at the carpet. The silver urn had been knocked from the mantel and the ashes within it were strewn all over the floor. I felt so bad for Gemma. Between her mother and her parasomnia and now this earthquake, she'd been through so much in the past few months. I gave her a hug and told her I was sorry, and strangely, instead of tearing up as I expected, she smiled at me. "It's all right, dear. Nothing we can't replace, right?" She stretched her arms above her head and yawned. "I'll help you clean up in the morning. Too tired at the moment." Without another word, she turned around and made her way back upstairs to bed. How she was so calm, I had no clue. I spent some time tending to my leg and was pleased to see that the cut was quite small and probably wouldn't need stitches. After making sure there was no glass left in my skin, I patched myself up and got to work cleaning. I couldn't afford to wait until morning, not when Gemma could sleepwalk right onto a shard of broken glass on the floor. By the time the sun rose, I had cleaned up everything except Therese's ashes, which I figured I should let Gemma attend to. It's Saturday afternoon at the moment, and I'm sitting outside trying to make sense of what happened. Gemma's still asleep somehow. I've checked on her a few times and she seems alright, no more parasomnia-related incidents. I'm glad she's getting her sleep right now, she's certainly earned it. I should go back inside and make food at some point, but... well, this just sounds paranoid. But that thing I felt last night, that deep-rooted sense of wrongness, it never really went away. I didn't realize how bad it had gotten until I stepped outside and it felt like a weight had been lifted off of my shoulders. Maybe what my wife and I need is a change of pace. We're only an hour drive away from the coast, and the sea breeze is good for the soul. I think this evening I'll drive us out to that little inn on the beach and take some time away from all this. That'd do Gemma good, I think. Oh, speak of the devil, I see Gemma looking down at me from our bedroom upstairs. She's pulled the curtain back just enough to peek out the window. I wonder how long she's been standing there, smiling at me.